My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and just before we get proceedings underway, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the items that I hope have been left on your chair. On Thursday the 9th of May we have in this very room a discussion on was the euro a mistake and does it have a future. That's a public event, please do come along to that. And on Wednesday the 29th of May we have a special evening with Martin Durkin, the television producer and director who made the documentary Margaret, Death of a Revolutionary, which was broadcast a couple of weeks ago. And if you're interested in coming to either of those events, the details are on the bottom of those leaflets. On to tonight's discussion. The rise of fixed odds betting terminals in the high street bookmakers has caused consternation, I think it's fair to say, in some quarters, with claims indeed that they are the crack cocaine of gambling. Is that really the case? Or is this just the latest in a series of scares about gambling, as we've seen in a whole range of other issues, that's supercasinos, internet gaming and the like? This very week the IEA has published this report, The Crack Cocaine of Gambling, which should also be on your chairs, written by Christopher Snowdon, the head of the IEA's Lifestyle Economics workstream. And you may also have seen coverage in the Sunday Mirror or indeed in today's Metro newspaper. So Chris Snowden, who's written this pamphlet, is with us here tonight. And there's been a slight change to our panel, but I'm delighted that Tom Greatrex is joining us. Tom has to leave at 7 o'clock though, so after we've heard his words he will be fleeing the room. Please don't assume that that's because he's taken umbrage or offence. It may be the case, but not necessarily the case. We are also joined, we'll hear from Chris first, but we're also joined by Neil Goulden of the British Bookmakers Association, Eugene Farrar of GRASP, the Gambling Reform and Society Protection Group, and Anthony Jennens of Gamcare. A very good and warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask each speaker to speak for no more than 10 minutes. And we'll start with Christopher Snowden, who, as I've mentioned, is the newly appointed head of the IEA's Lifestyle Economics Unit and author of this report. He also wrote The Art of Suppression in 2011, The Spirit Level Delusion in 2010, and Velvet Glove, Iron Fist in 2009. He describes his work as focusing on pleasure, prohibition and dodgy statistics. So, Chris, are these machines pleasurable? Should they be prohibited? Are they indeed dodgy? Please welcome Chris Snowden.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. I will assume, since you're all here at an event specifically about fixed odds betting terminals, that you know what they are. Just in case you don't, they are basically virtual gaming machines, which are found predominantly in bookmakers. Indeed, they're only allowed to be in bookmakers and casinos. The appeal of them, or at least part of the appeal, I think, is that the results of each game it comes about from a entirely random number generator. The machines, unlike traditional fruit machines, are not preset to pay out after a certain amount of time or after a certain amount of money has gone into them. So it is a genuine game of luck each and every time. And also the nature of the game means that they pay out more regularly than the average jackpot machine. Roulette is by far the most popular game on them, which of course is a very simple game, a game that's been around for many, many years. You can play in a casino, you can play online, of course, these days as well. They have, as Mark suggested, attracted quite a remarkable amount of publicity in the last year or two in particular. They've been subject to the Panorama documentary, the Dispatches documentary, and speaking about them today on the radio, I was reminded once again that there are certain cliches, I think it's fair to describe them as, which are used routinely in every TV, radio or newspaper report to do with these machines. The articles themselves may as well be written by a machine. You can be sure that they will be referred to as a crack cocaine of gambling. They will very likely say that people can and do lose £18,000 in an hour on them. That in the UK we spend or lose £42 billion a year on these machines, and that as a result of bookmakers supposedly chasing this market, we have had a dramatic proliferation of bookmakers. There's a bookmaker now every 10 yards on every high street, and they are crammed full of people who are playing these machines and doing nothing else. What I wanted to do with this particular report is assess the claims made against the fixed odds betting terminals to see if there is a justification for banning them, which is essentially what the anti-gambling or anti-fixed odds betting terminal campaigners are asking for. Some of them say they merely want to bring the stakes and prizes down, but they're aware that the level at which they want to bring them down will make the games unappealing and financially not worth operating for the bookmakers. So let's just take each of those, each of the supposed truisms that are reported in almost every article related to these machines. The crackdown of gambling phrase is a very interesting one. When I dug a little deeper into the history of this term, it stretches back to about the mid-80s, which is to say it's been around for nearly as long as crack cocaine itself has. It was coined by Donald Trump, I believe, in the 1980s when he was trying to protect his casino investment against possible Keno lottery game. Keno is a sort of form of bingo or video bingo. And since then it has been applied to pretty much every single form of gambling that has come along. Every new variant, every new gambling product has been described as the crack cocaine of gambling. It's been applied to scratch cards, to lotteries, to the Keno I mentioned, especially to internet gambling in America. And it is, in America, it's mainly being used, particularly in relation to online gambling. And it came across to this country to be specifically tagged to these fixed odds betting terminals 3 or 4 years ago or so. But it can't be attributed to any one person, let alone any one expert. It's just an eye-catching and attention-grabbing pejorative term, which implies deprivation and implies that these games are extremely addictive, which is something I'll come to in a moment or two. The idea that people can lose £18,000 an hour, well, this is at least theoretically true, although it would be impossible in practice. The maximum stake of these machines is £100, and in theory you can spin the wheel every 20 seconds. Of course, the possibility of somebody actually having £18,000 in cash and be able to feed it so quickly is beyond improbable. But the more important thing to note is that you would have to lose every game. You'd have to lose 180 games in succession, and if you're talking red or black on roulette, you're basically talking about a 50-50 shot. The chances of doing that is something like 2.5 billion, or the equivalent of winning the national lottery 3 times in a row. So it simply wouldn't happen. And that relates then to the next claim, which is that £42 billion is spent or lost on these machines every year. Again, this confuses stakes with prizes. You're confusing what's being fed into the machine with what's being spent and lost and never seen again. Again, if you're talking about a game which is virtually 50-50, then every other time you play, you're winning your money back and also winning the same amount on top of it. So the relevant figure is not how much is actually pumped in and then come back as winnings, but how much is spent, how much is lost, as it were. And that figure is much lower. It's 32 times lower. It's about 1.5 billion a year across the entire country, which is a significant sum. It's about the same actually as the amount spent in traditional over-the-counter betting in bookmakers. And finally, the dramatic proliferation of bookmakers. There simply has been no dramatic proliferation. Bookmaker numbers peaked at around about 16,000 in the late 60s, early 70s. They then fell for the rest of the century, hit an all-time low in the year 2000, around about 8,500, I think. And since then, there's been an extremely modest increase of about 4 or 5%, barely going beyond the rate of population growth. It is quite possible, and I think it's true to say that in certain areas, particularly perhaps in central London, there have been examples of bookmakers opening up more premises than they would have if they didn't want to get many machines in. The problem here is you have a slightly arbitrary limit on the number of these machines that you can have in any bookmakers. They are clearly popular with some people, and so I think it's accepted by the bookmaking industry that there have been some examples where there have been more bookmakers than there actually need in an area. But of course it must be fairly uncommon, otherwise you would genuinely see a dramatic proliferation, not this extremely modest increase over the last 12, 15 years or so. And if the problem is a proliferation of bookmakers, which seems to be the message of the dispatches programme, then you can just increase the limit on the machines. I'm not quite sure why having a large and thriving bookmaking, competitive bookmaking market on the high street should necessarily be a bad thing, but if that is your concern, then you can increase the limits. I think 6 would be ample for any bookmaker, and you would then have fewer betting shops. But we should remember that the bookmaking industry is a competitive industry. It's better to have 5 or 6 competing firms in an area than it is to have 2 or even 1 betting shop. Like every other industry, the consumer benefits from having choice and competition on the market. So the main bullet points that are constantly directed towards us on the issue of fixed odds betting terminals are either very misleading or they're just demonstrably untrue. Now, you can argue that all I'm doing is giving examples of hyperbole and exaggerated statistics, which often campaigners will resort to. But the fact of the matter is, if you drill below that and look at the empirical evidence, there really isn't much in this crusade other than hyperbole and exaggerations. It's unfortunate that the data we have in this country on problem gambling is not as thorough as it could be. We had 3 excellent reports since 1999, the British Gambling Prevalence Survey. Really good, solid academic stuff that looks at problem gambling and looks at patterns of play and prevalence of different types of gambling. That has since been cancelled by the Gambling Commission, which is difficult for somebody writing a report like this. The last one was in 2010 and was a bit of a cliffhanger. It was unclear whether there had been any increase in problem gambling nationwide or not. But there was no implication in that report, or indeed any of the 2 previous reports, that fixed odds betting terminals were uniquely addictive or uniquely seductive. And piecing together such evidence as there is since 2010, it's certainly not the number one it's not the number one candidate in terms of either people playing it on a very regular basis or people losing tremendous sums of money, nor indeed of actually spreading out across the general population, which is what you would expect if it was really to be likened to crack cocaine. It seems to be certainly a popular form of gambling with a relatively small percentage of the population. There's only about 4% in the last survey, 4% of the population plays these machines, which does sound very few, but in actual fact it's about the same as the number of people who bet on dog racing and so on. I think in closing, I think the important thing to stress is that it's not the 1970s anymore, and what the entire gambling sector is changing at a very rapid rate, and technology and virtual gaming is a very big part of that. You can't put the genie back in the bottle in terms of the internet, in terms of betting on your mobile phones, and this is, although the British online industry is very well regulated, of course you can't stop people going beyond the companies that are on these shores, based on these shores, and so things are changing. The reality is that horse racing is not as popular as it once was. Dog racing is on its last legs in most parts of the country, quite frankly. There is a genuine consumer demand for different types of gambling, for virtual gambling. We have a fairly chronic under-provision of casinos in this country, so it's all right saying if you want to play roulette, go to a casino. For significant numbers of people, you're looking at a 50 mile or more drive to go to a casino. If we believe in a regulatory system for gambling, and of course there have to be safeguards, there are somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population with a problem with their gambling. It's not high by international standards, but it's there, and the grown-up approach to this issue is accepting that it's there and it always will be there, and we need to help people who do have compulsive gambling problems. But at the same time, 99% of the population do not, and we need to respect their rights to a bit of fun and diversion and entertainment. And the fact that there is £1.5 billion spent on these particular machines across the country indicates not so much that these are chronically addictive, but just that they are quite popular. And it serves nobody any good to ban them or to severely over-regulate them on the basis of what is really no more than hearsay. Thank you.
Chris, thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Chris. There has been considerable controversy in public debate and in the newspapers about this issue. And in fact, just this week, our next speaker, Tom Greatrex, Labour Member of Parliament, led an adjournment debate on fixed odds betting terminals. We're incredibly grateful that you've joined us at such late notice, Tom. And I think we've just about perfectly timed it, so your 10 minutes starts now. You may have to leave just with your final remarks. So please welcome Tom Greatrex.
Thanks very much, Mark. As I sat down, Neil said to me, it must be a bit like going into the lion's den for a Labour MP to come to the IEA. And I remarked to him, it's not really, because I've got no chance of losing any votes here. So, I suppose I just wanted to start by setting out my position, because as Mark said, I did lead an adjournment debate on Monday evening on this, and because of the vagaries of the way that Parliament works, because other business finished earlier, it was a longer debate than adjournment debates normally are, which meant there were more people were contributed in it, and I think there were some good issues raised. I would start by saying, though, that because sometimes this is portrayed as being pro-gambling versus anti-gambling, and I'm not here on behalf of any campaigning organisation, although I have spoken to them, as I've spoken to people from one of the high street bookmakers and received briefings from lots of people over the past few weeks. I'm not anti-gambling. I think we should recognise that very many people, whether it's at the casino, on the horses, even at bingo, people are able to gamble as a form of entertainment and leisure pursuits perfectly fine without any problem at all. In fact, many people, people like me, I have to confess, I do have a bet every year. I bet on Fulham winning the FA Cup. It's not come in yet, but I do go to my one of my local bookmakers and place that bet. It's probably more for their amusement than it is for mine, really. But so I don't come at this from being anti-gambling, is the first point I wanted to make. Nor do I believe that we should that fixed odd betting terminals should be banned either. I'm not sure. I mean, there are different grades of opinion among some of the people who've expressed concerns, but that's certainly not my position. I come at this from the position of a constituency MP who had a constituent come to me year and a half ago, I think it was, basically saying he'd managed over the course of around a month lose £25,000 in one machine in a branch of high street bookmakers close to him. He didn't come to me to say he had a problem with gambling. He came to me to say these machines must be rigged because I've not won. Now, often people who know about this will tell you that that's a pretty good indicative sign that someone's probably got a problem, and from that that individual has actually accepted he's got a problem and is getting help for it. I've also spoken to a number of other individuals in my constituency who've either come to me, and I also sort out my local Gamblers Anonymous group. Now, obviously, a Gamblers Anonymous group is by definition a group of people who have a problem with gambling, and I'm not trying to suggest that that's necessarily the complete picture. But what struck me amongst that group was there was a very clear divide between those who were maybe 30-ish and under, and those who are older and where their problem with gambling developed or first started. And it was very, very apparent that those people who were the younger people within that group, and it was about half and half in terms of the age profile, and also all of the women within that group were people who had developed a problem with gambling on fixed odds betting terminals. Now, again, that's not scientific, it's anecdotal. But that is why I have been pressing for much more evidence on this, because I think one of the problems is that since the government abandons the gambling prevalence survey, there is very little empirical evidence to start with. And to that regard, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with some of what Chris had said. But I do think, I mean, there are bits of evidence, and I don't think I've only had a chance to quickly flip through the report today, so you may have mentioned, but not in the executive summary. There are some studies drawn from the last gambling prevalence survey, which do point to some specific concerns around problem gambling. And I think perhaps because you may do this debate, it's slightly disservice to suggest there's none at all, because I think there is some, but there needs to be very much more. And that's the point of the debate that I had on Monday night, was twofold really. One was to press Hugh Robertson, the Minister, on the research that needs to happen to inform policy. The other side of this, I suppose, which was touched on, was in relation to the clustering of bookmakers. And Hugh Robertson made this point in the debate, and I've seen it in briefing, and Chris repeated it in terms of the overall number of bookmakers. But what that doesn't expose is that what has happened in some places, and not in all places, but in some places, is there has been a move from tertiary sites to high street sites. And in some communities, including one of the towns in my constituency, we have seen in a relatively short period of time more bookmakers cluster together. Now, clustering happens with estate agents, with coffee shops. Supermarkets are very good at going to where their market is. So, you know, that you might say that's normal behaviour for a retailer with a high street presence to seek to do, to go to where their customer is. My concern is that what that enables is, or what that prevents actually, is it for the self-regulation for problem gamblers to be very effective. Because what can happen, because if you've got a problem, you go in and you have to sign in yourself. So you have to declare you've got a problem yourself. If you've got 3 or 4, I've got in one town in my constituency 4 different high street chains within 50 yards of each other, 3 on one side of the road, 1 on the other. You can go from place to place, and I've spoken to people who have done that. Now, that's why I have concerns about this, and that's why I think that there does need to be more evidence, and that the government needs to take it seriously. And in relation to clustering, I think that's something where it shouldn't be central government deciding that. I think there should be much more flexibility for local authorities. And another concern is that the local authorities have a relatively limited degree of flexibility in being able to determine whether they feel their community has an oversupply of machines, and being able to make that decision for themselves through the licensing and planning processes. Now, I know the argument will come back after I've left, that of course these powers do exist, but the reality is, if you look at what's happening in relation to Newham Council already, is that is indicative of at least one community who feel that they're going to challenge this legally, and that will get to the end of that. Well, I think the next stage is in June, and I suspect there may well be other stages, and it may take a few months or a period of time to get to the end of that legal process. But there is a concern there that I think properly needs to be addressed, so that local communities can help to make that decision for themselves in terms of over-provision. Just in response to some of the figures which I've just flipped through in terms of the executive summary that Chris mentioned about the losing £18,000 in an hour. Now, I'm in one of my other hats, I'm Shadow Energy Minister, and I get hugely frustrated at some of the exaggerated claims that you get from some campaigning organisations and some pressure groups from time to time, and it doesn't take long to delve into it, and you find that they'll be theoretically possible, and it is theoretically possible to stake £18,000 in an hour. I think it's, as you said, Chris, it'll be pretty difficult to do it. It is possible to stake £300 in a minute. I think it's not so much the overall figure, and again, you know, I did see something, I thought I had it with me, but I don't, what the odds would be of losing £80,000 in an hour, but it was something like winning the lottery 3 weeks in a row, I think. Or there's a figure, there's a statistic there, and I don't know whether that's, I've not looked at that in a huge amount of detail to check the veracity of that, but what I do know is, and so I've never suggested that as being the case, but what I do know is, and I know it from people that I've spoken to, constituents of mine, and I know it from other people who've contacted me and other people who've contacted other MPs about this, and this is where the concern comes from, is that it is possible to spend significant amounts of money in a very short time on the machines, and people will tell you the way they feel that whether or not they're addictive needs to be properly tested in evidence, but people will tell you anecdotally they feel as though they're in the zone with the machine and they were putting more money in than they realise, quicker than they realise. Now, that is something which really does need to be looked into further, and that's why, in terms of what I was saying on Monday, is that there needs to be much more empirical evidence. I have expressed in the debate, and I did get to sit next to Neil very briefly, but some concerns about the way in which that survey is being funded, and the perception there could be in terms of the independence of it. I think it's vital that it is independent and verifiable, and seem to be so as well, because without that empirical basis, then it's going to be very hard to be able to draw conclusions. So I'm not sure whether this is, I wouldn't necessarily agree that this is just the latest moral crusade on gambling. I think there is a very real issue here. I think it does need to, the evidence needs to be collected, and it does need to be assessed carefully. That's broadly what Hugh Robertson said. It's broadly what one of my, not my colleagues, Tracy Crouch on the Conservative benches said from her experience. That's what my experience suggests. It is to a certain extent anecdotal, but it's anecdotal because there is a lack of evidence. We need the evidence, but we shouldn't be, I think, in a position where this debate degenerates into pro-gambling versus anti-gambling, because for very, very many people, it's very far from those extremes. It's about how you best regulate gambling where it needs to be regulated, at the same time as preserving people's freedom to be able to spend the money that they have legally in whichever way they choose, because I am individually, as my own perspective is, I'm very, very reticent about the state in any form seeking to regulate individuals' behaviour, but sometimes it does need to happen. And I think in this case, there is certainly a case for further examination of this to determine whether that needs to happen. And in relation to planning and licensing, I think there's a very, very strong case for local authorities to have a much clearer set of powers to be able to determine those decisions in terms of oversupply for themselves. So I've said all that, and then I'm going to leave. So I'm very sorry for doing so. I hope the rest of the debate goes well, and I look forward to maybe getting to that later on.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom, thanks so much. Really appreciate fitting this into your diary this evening. I hope we haven't made you late for your next appointment. Our next speaker is Neil Goulden, the chairman of the Association of British Bookmakers, the trade association for betting shop operators. ABB members represent, I think it's around about 80% of the overall betting shop market in the UK. Neil, we look forward to your take on these machines, how and if they should be regulated. Please welcome Neil.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think my starting point is I totally agree with most of the things that both the other speakers have said so far. But before I share my own views, there's just three things I'd like to say. Firstly, my thanks to Chris Snowden for his paper. It certainly brings clarity to some of the misleading statements put about as facts and evidence by people campaigning against fixed odds betting terminals. I think, to quote Chris Backett himself, he did say in the report that those spreading moral panic about FOBTs are guilty of gross misrepresentation of the facts. So I don't think I can add anything further than what he said there. The second point, I would totally agree with what Tom said. I think we do need more evidence. I don't think we know enough about machines in this country. I don't think we know enough about machine players, not just in this country, but around the world. I mean, machines are fairly modern technology, and technology is moving all of the time. I say it in the context, I don't think we know enough yet about the internet and the impact of the internet in our society. So we do need more evidence. I also totally agree with him about local democracy and letting local people make local decisions. But I don't think that certain products should be singled out. There should be the same treatment that other products would have on the high street. Just in answer to his question, by the way, the odds of losing £18,000 in an hour is 11 trillion million to 1. So just to give you the odds that he couldn't find in his facts and figures. Thirdly, I'm not here this evening to dismiss genuine concerns regarding problem gambling and consumer protection. There are circa 500,000 problem gamblers, give or take, in this country. The figures vary from the different screens, but so I'm not going to hang my hat on the figure, but roughly 500,000 problem gamblers in Britain. And whilst that's low by international standards, and you can't regulate risk out of life, we don't want to see that number go up. The industry doesn't want to see that number go up, and society doesn't want to see that number go up. Through the work that I do with RGT and with Gamcare over the past 10 years, I'm personally committed to encouraging people to gamble responsibly, to help and to stop them getting into problems with gambling, and making sure that those people who do get into problems with their gambling get the help and support that they need. So that's kind of the starting point. But what I am here to do is to try and argue against the singling out and demonisation, if you like, of FOBTs. And also against what I see as unworkable and even dangerous solutions to what I also see as an overhyped potential problem. So I'm really campaigning for improved player protection, yes, but I want it to be effective and sustainable. And by that I mean that it doesn't impinge, exactly as Tom said, it doesn't impinge on the rights of individuals to make their own decisions, their freedom of choice, but it protects the weak and the vulnerable in society, and also doesn't stifle legitimate economic business growth. So that's where I'm actually coming from as a person. So player protection, yes, but it's got to be workable and sustainable. So are FMBTs the crack cocaine of gambling? And my answer to that is no, and no because. Point one, there is no direct link between fixed odds betting terminals and problem gambling. Leighton Vaughan Williams, the professor at Nottingham Trent University, recently conducted a secondary review of the last prevalence study, and I quote from what he said: "It is therefore not possible to single out some types of gambling activities as being specifically associated with problem gambling. Problem gamblers seem to differ from other gamblers by a higher frequency of participation in a wide variety of gambling activities." So what he was saying, in effect, was that it's about the person, the individual, rather than the product. That's supported by some work done by NatSen, who did it for the Gambling Commission, specifically looking at machines and the machine data out of the last prevalence study. And they said that the report from NatSen, this Gambling Commission words, is consistent with the earlier analysis, which similarly highlighted the strong association between problem gambling and participating in a wide range of differing gambling activities. The report suggests that a joined-up, cross-venue, cross-sector approach to the development of harm minimisation strategies might be beneficial. So again, both those pieces of research from eminent researchers point to the same thing, which is about looking at the individual rather than the product. If you look specifically at some of the statistics around fixed odds betting terminals, you get to the same area. 70% of fixed odds betting terminal players play less than once a month. On average, they play for 9 minutes, and on average, they spend £7.55 per session of gambling. That is not indicative in any way of a highly or intrinsically addictive product. That doesn't mean that an individual in there doesn't have problems, but it's saying that is not. If the average people only play once a month and they only play for 9 minutes and they spend £7.55, it is not indicative of an intrinsically addictive product. So that's my point one. Solutions must be person, not product centred. Secondly, there's no evidence that stake reduction will be effective in harm reduction. It's a blunt, and if I may say so, political instrument. Jurisdictions with lower stakes and prize limits than this country have higher problem gambling numbers. Jurisdictions with higher limits have lower problem gambling numbers than in this country. There is no correlation, direct correlation internationally between the control of stakes and prizes and the levels of problem gambling. Tonight, any of you can go out of here, 30 million internet devices. You could stake up to £10,000. You can win £2.5 million on the internet. Why are we so fixated about £100 in 8,000 retail outlets when there's 30 million mobile or internet-enabled mobile devices out there? I also make the point that that problem gambling is not stake-related. A person who comes in infrequently and spends £10 could have a problem, and a person who comes in frequently and spends £100 might not have a problem. It is not stake-related. So my second point is that even if there is a problem, stake may not be the solution. Thirdly, there is evidence of social and economic harm if, as people are campaigning for, there's a 50-fold reduction in the stake on fixed odds betting terminals to £2. People think betting offices are coining it in, but actually betting offices have been slowing down for the last decade or more. And into the mid-2000s, they were on a decline. Since then, overall, it's at best flat. And fixed odds betting terminals were an innovative and modern technology that bookmakers came up to develop their business and actually save some of the businesses. The betting industry, or the industry that I represent, gives £2.3 billion, or contributes £2.3 billion to GDP, £5 billion to gross value added, pays £1 billion in tax, supports directly 40,000 jobs, contributes £175 million a year to the British horse racing and greyhound industry, which supports another 60,000 jobs, has a 56% female workforce, and 25% of the workforce are under the age of 24, and it pays £60 million in business rates. So it's a huge economic contributor. However, 2,700 betting offices, 30% of the betting offices in this country make now less than £10,000 per annum. So bookies are not raking in. Those betting offices are on the margins of profitability. And I'd also like to just pick up something Tom did say in the debate the other night when he referred to what I call the displacement theory. And the theory that if £1 billion of spend on FOBTs is taken away, that the the 7,000 jobs that will be lost from that, that money will be displaced into other forms of spending, and there will be 20,000 jobs created, so that therefore FOBTs are costing X number of jobs. Does anyone really believe that £1 billion spent on fixed odds betting terminals will go into Marks and Spencer's, B&Q and Tesco? I mean, do people really believe that? 100% displacement theory of economics. I mean, it is just not feasible. If you suppress supply rather than demand, it's dangerous. You will get a black market. It's already happening in places in gambling. You will get a black market develop that will be unregulated, untaxed, run by criminals with no protections for players. And that's not what we want in our society. So my third message really is that a material reduction in FOBT stakes without evidence will have disastrous economic and social consequences. Fourthly, I think we need to look for better solutions. Player-centered codes of conduct, and I'm personally driving for this, not just in the ABB, but across other parts of the gambling industry. BACTA, the casino industry, and BISL are all looking at now developing codes of conduct. What we should be focusing on is self-limiting time and money features, staff training for interventions, and to help people who therefore need our help. The industry is committed to workable and sustainable consumer protection. So point four, or my fourth point, is let's do it now. Let's build on codes of conduct. When the final research comes out next year, whatever comes out of that research can then be built on and add to those codes of conduct that takes us forward in a better way. So in conclusion, if you accept that problem gambling is about the person, not the product, the stake limits are a blunt and ineffective solution with profound negative consequences, we must all look for better ways to improve consumer protection. The British betting industry is fully committed to consumer protection. We want to work with a wide range of stakeholders to deliver it in a workable and sustainable way. And as I said before, what that means is measures which are proportionate, evidence-based, and thus effective in reducing harm without impinging on the rights of the 99% to enjoy their leisure time as they see fit, and without the devastating side consequences of any unjustified move on fixed odds betting terminals. Because there are a number of very important philosophical points at play here. Individuals' right to make informed choices, protecting the vulnerable but not restricting the majority, consumer protection and promoting responsible gambling, which the industry must do. They don't do enough of it, they must do more of it. Legitimate business interests in a legal and highly regulated industry, and economic growth and jobs. Those are all the things that are at stake. It's not just about a machine in a betting office. There are much more fundamental things at stake in the debate that we're having. So we would like to see a less emotive and more measured debate. We warmly welcome talking to other stakeholders. We warmly welcome further research into the area. And we will engage positively and collectively with other people in trying to develop those codes of conduct. So if you believe in workable player protection, let's work in partnership is the message I would like to leave you with. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Eugene Farrar of GRASP, the Gambling Reform and Society Protection Group. Eugene is a former problem gambler, and GRASP is an independent reform group set up by former gambling addicts. And indeed, Eugene and I have previously discussed the topic of gambling when we appeared alongside each other on BBC Radio 4's Moral Maze on the topic a few weeks ago. So Eugene, perhaps you can now give us your take on fixed odds betting terminals. Please welcome Eugene.
Thank you very much. Good evening. First of all, Chris, I just have to apologise. I also haven't had a chance to read the report in full, as I just got it this afternoon, and not quite a chance. First of all, yeah, I'd like to, in the press, Grayson Post and various other publications recently, there's been a lot of talk of myths associated with the anti-problem gambling campaign. And I say anti-problem gambling campaign, and I'd like to put emphasis on the word problem, because I feel that, yeah, it's all very well and good saying we need to cooperate and we need to sort of like find a workable solution together. But there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of terminology aimed at groups like GRASP, Fairer Gambling, Salvation Army, other faith groups and social organisations, and all being kind of generally bundled together as anti-gambling groups. It's not what GRASP is about, and I strongly believe it isn't what the other groups are about either. GRASP's homepage states quite clearly that we're anti-problem gambling, not anti-gambling. We're not on any moral crusade at all. It's I don't know what has given the industry that impression. It's not a moral crusade in any shape or form. So we constitute approximately 500 members who largely have had problem gambling issues either currently or in the past or historically. To some degree there are people who have had family members or close associates, and surprisingly, in many respects, there are quite a few concerned industry professionals who are also part of the group, ranging from people working in betting shops, people working in casinos and arcades, but quite a lot of people working in licensed betting offices do visit our pages with numerous concerns. I think, first of all, the idea that, yeah, I think really common sense dictates that the idea of £18,000 an hour is largely theoretical. It isn't a figure that GRASP has subscribed to. However, if that's pro-rated out, as Tom indicated previously, a person embarking upon an afternoon's gambling on a fixed odds machine can still sustain and incur pretty significant losses. £18,000 an hour is theoretical. £300 a minute isn't. Believe me, I've done it. I know plenty of people have done it and done a lot more. The odds of doing £18,000 in an hour are astronomical. Of course they are. I think, was it 11 billion or something? 11 trillion or something, was it? But that, yeah, that assumes, and I think also Chris's reference to 50-50 betting, that assumes a particular pattern of betting, red and black, high numbers, low numbers, one column or the other. But that isn't how, in my own experience, and fairly extensive experience now over the last 2.5 years, speaking with former FOBT and current FOBT players, that isn't how people bet. People don't bet £100 generally on red or black. They may well do. People bet £10 on a spread of numbers, and it's very possible, quite probable that gaps will be found and significant losing runs. Okay, not £18,000, but let's face it, we don't have to lose £18,000 in an hour to have a massive impact upon somebody's life, on the life of the family, and the losses to the economy as well, of that money going into a betting shop and not being spent elsewhere. I think the term crack cocaine is particularly interesting because the analogy is that crack cocaine is obviously a highly addictive substance, but in the gambling, excuse me, it's not enough room, but in the last two prevalence studies for opiate and crack addiction, curiously enough, the first one being, I'm going to refer to in 2008-2009, showed between the two, the subsequent one then being in 2009-2010, showed an actual reduction in opiate and crack cocaine use in Britain. It actually showed a reduction of over 15,000 people, that constituting around 6%. And that was a survey carried out by the National Treatment Authority. Yet the two gambling prevalence surveys in this country do actually show a slight increase of problem gambling in the UK. So the analogy is quite an interesting one, in actual fact there's an argument that, that gambling addiction is the biggest rising addiction in this country, and that is actually endorses that view by Action on Addiction. And historically, machine gambling has always played an enormous part in machine addiction. I think the assertion that it's about the individual and not the product flies in the face of some very established research, albeit internationally, because there does seem to be a lack of domestic research in the UK. But there's an enormous amount of research, mainly relating to machine play in Las Vegas. In the 80s, generally accepted that meetings of Gamblers Anonymous and people receiving treatment in clinics, it was predominantly for table games, card games, sportsbook addictions. But Bo Bernard, in a report in 2000, stated that on observation of one particular clinic in Las Vegas, over 90% of individuals were receiving treatment for addictions to fruit machine gambling. Not just fruit machines, but video fruit machines, video gambling. So, we're starting to see striking similarities between that mode of gambling and the fixed odds machines. And in 2002, there was a series of studies in the USA that stated that video machine players became addicted 3 to 4 times more rapidly than other gamblers, even if they had not had problems engaging with other products previously. And that's a series of reports that started in 2002. We got to 2007, and Gaming Laboratory International that carried an article in 2007, issue 72, that rather than indicating a pathology in the gambler, impaired control and subsequent problem development are an understandable and natural consequence of regular high-intensity machine play. This is all fairly established, well-researched documentation proving a very, very strong line of machine-driven gambling addiction. And in 2010, there was an independent federal commission report in Australia stated that the problems experienced by gamblers, many just ordinary consumers, are as much a consequence of the technology of the games, their accessibility and the nature and conduct of venues, as they are a consequence of the traits of consumers themselves. So this notion that it's about the individual and not the product is quite easily debunked in my view, and indeed the view of Grasp. If it wasn't about the product, we've just had submissions made to a review of stakes and prizes, where one of the overriding rationales of the review was to provide support to what is perceived as an ailing design and production industry. If it isn't about the product, then I'm afraid I'm not convinced, because why do we need to provide respite, if you like, and encourage growth in a sector such as machine design? If it isn't about the product, I really don't get that. It's about a human-machine association, really, and design has historically played a great role in machine play. The environment, from the environment in casinos, from the design of the machines, from the colours of the livery, the audio content, all plays a role. And the intensity of machine play is definitely a driver in developing problem gambling. I think specifically to FOBTs, I think the idea that's been put about that there's no empirical evidence, I really can't agree with that, I'm afraid. I think that the current statistic from the gambling clinic, the National Problem Gambling Clinic, is that high 40%, high 48, 49% I think it is, of their current referrals cited that fixed odds machines were a problem, at least part of the problem of people who've chosen to be referred to the clinic. And this to me it's alarming that this is dismissed as anecdotal. There was also a further re-study of the information from the last gambling prevalence survey carried out by Jim Orford and Mark Griffiths, which indicated that in actual fact, the fixed odds, the actual spend on fixed odds machines placed it second behind greyhound racing in terms of the number, the proportion of participants that are problem gamblers. So I think it was somewhere in the region of 23% of people playing those machines were deemed to be problem gamblers, and that was on the very same data, again, you know, carried out by three academics that contributed largely to the prevalence survey data, and as such, I think stands up as fairly good evidence. Again, to dismiss that as anecdotal. GRASP as a forum, which is regularly contributed to by a number of people, many of whom cite that they've tried to give up gambling many times, enjoyed great success, only to go in, somebody this week, only to go in and play a fixed odd machine and develop a problem. Again, we've repeatedly given examples of people who haven't had problems with other forms of gambling, and unfortunately, you know, fixed odds machines, yeah, and that's proven to be their Achilles heel. But it is about the product, it is about the person as well. So as such, the solution, I feel, needs to look at both. I agree with better player protection. GRASP agrees fully the need for a better, more robust exclusion policy. The technology's there, the sophisticated technology driving the machines that I'm sure could easily be diverted and exploited to provide a more robust central exclusion policy. Repeat play, features like that increase absolutely exponentially the speed at which the game can be played, favours only the intense player. It's of no benefit whatsoever to the recreational player, and notwithstanding claims by Fair Gambling amongst others that there needs to be a reduction to £2, well, I don't know whether £2, GRASP doesn't know whether £2 is the figure, but we certainly think that reduction in stakes has a role to play, and also gameplay features which increase the intensity of play. This isn't to say that players shouldn't accept responsibility for the problem. Of course, I speak to people every day in GRASP and in other contexts who fully accept responsibility for their problem, but they would also like the industry to accept some of theirs. Crack cocaine of gambling, I don't know. Is it? Arguably something quite worse. Thank you.
Eugene, thank you very much indeed. Our final speaker this evening is Anthony Jennens, Chairman of Gamcare, which provides information, advice, support and counselling for the prevention and treatment of problem gambling. Gamcare also works to support the development and implementation of responsible policies and practices by the gambling industry and recognises best practice through a certification scheme. So, Anthony, over to you.
Thank you for explaining who Gamcare are. Are FOBTs the new crack cane of gambling? Is the question I was posed. The answer is no. Firstly, they are not new, and this emotive epithet conjures up images which are irrelevant and inappropriate. Fixed odd betting terminals are legal. They've been in operation for about 10 years, and they are highly profitable for the operators. Were I the chairman of a large bookmaking company or its trade body, I would feel no need to apologise or seek to justify the existence and operation of fixed odds betting terminals per se. This may help to explain why I'm not the chairman of the Association of British Bookmakers. Again, were I the director of a public company which operated FOBTs, I would consider that as my first duty is to my shareholders, I would be in breach of that duty if I did not make use of them. Continuing on this theme, I'm greatly surprised that a campaign against these machines has sprung up after so much time has elapsed since their initial acceptance. The campaign is spearheaded not by the current government, or indeed the Gambling Commission, but by a strange alliance between a former gambling operator, Derek Webb, and a learned, well-respected academic, Jim Orford. The latter is confessedly an anti-gambler, the former is not, yet they join forces under the banner of fairer gambling, which begs the question, fairer to whom? Are we discussing the competitive edge that the bookies have acquired by dint of greater cunning, better lobbying, etc., 10 years ago? Has this edge suddenly become intolerably greater and reached a tipping point? I'm happy to assume that Chris Snowden's research provides an accurate picture and that no such surge has taken place. Have the odds against the punter changed the disadvantage of the punter? Or is the genuine concern that fixed odds betting terminals are inherently dangerously addictive? If I had any sense of the last question as an operator, I would not seek to excuse fixed odds betting terminals on the grounds that there is no causal link. There may well not be one, but it is an infelicitous phrase, in that that is exactly the wording that was used by the tobacco industry with regard to lung cancer and cigarettes for 20 years. Staying with the tobacco analogy, some of you may have seen a film called The Insider. In this film, the Vice President Philip Morris is quoted as describing the market for his company's products as the poor, the very young, and the terminally stupid. Some may think this summary would apply equally to those who play excessively on fixed odds betting terminals. About poverty, we can do little. Mr. Blair promised an end to it, and he's done a grand job collecting up the money, but he hasn't yet figured out how the redistribution works. I don't think any of us involved in this debate have lost the aspirations to end world poverty, but we can do something about the other two categories, and for me, that is what this evening is about. There is a great deal of humbug on every side of the argument about B2 machines. The pros and antis inevitably conjure with statistics to suit their particular argument, as you already heard this evening. But the most invidious position is the one occupied by the government. On the one hand, they very badly need the revenue provided by gambling in all its forms. Focus is currently on FOBTs because of their high profitability and consequently the returns they make to HMRC. But at the same time, government seems to find it difficult to ignore the clamour of indignation against these machines, especially when the very same people who permitted these machines in the first place, i.e. members of the former Labour government, are joining in and crying, "We made a terrible mistake, something must be done." Indeed, but what? £500,000 has been raised by the industry, from the industry, to carry out research into B2 machines. This research will take quite a while, and as yet the extent of the brief is shrouded in secrecy. It doesn't greatly matter, because what we need to consider is what actions are possible as a result of any given set of findings. If, for example, it were to be conclusively established these machines were dangerously addictive and should all be removed from the ambient and convenient locations in which they currently reside, would they be? Almost certainly not. Were this to happen, there would be the hue and cry that the bookies would, without these machines, be unable to pay the racing levy, which would herald the end of racing, and between 60,000 and 80,000 jobs would be lost. A somewhat spurious, but nonetheless politically unacceptable scenario. At the other end of the spectrum, the research may conclude that FOBTs are no more or less addictive than many other forms of gambling, and the status quo should be maintained. In between, there are all sorts of shades of grey, and many scenarios that would result in tinkering at the edges of the problem, should there be deemed to be a problem. This tinkering will require lengthy consultations and will provide employment to quite a number of people. That apart, will it achieve anything significant in terms of providing real player protection for the most vulnerable? Personally, I doubt it. So I return to the very young and the terminally stupid. People are deemed stupid because they are ignorant. They are ignorant because they lack education. Here we can all do something. The industry, which contributes generously to treatment, can start to dig in its pocket to fund education, particularly of the young, and to ensure that at an early age people are aware of the availability of help and advice. At the same time, the anti-FOBT forces could utilise their formidable PR machine to ensure that players, or would-be players, understand the nature of risk and as a consequence play with greater circumspection or not at all. There are probably not many people in this room tonight who regularly play FOBTs excessively, and fairly few who play them at all. Why not? Because for the most part we're educated. As to the very young, i.e. underage gamblers, who play B2 machines and indeed indulge in other forms of gambling, we can protect them better. I cannot and do not ever comment on what the law should or should not be, but I can be critical of breaches of the law. The Gambling Commission's mystery shopper exercises demonstrated that age verification protocols were unacceptably weak in too many places. To my mind, the penalties for permitting underage gambling should be draconian. The excuse that a young, inexperienced betting shop manager cannot possibly carry out all his or her duties simultaneously does not wash. The enormous benefits that these machines bestow on their operators also carry responsibilities, and these can and should be better observed. In conclusion, there seems to be no point in demonising or prohibiting fixed odds betting terminals. Prohibition in almost every field has caused far more trouble than the ill it sought to eradicate. Demonisation can frequently make its object even more attractive to the adrenaline-driven risk-taker. I do not have any great faith in the prospect that any of the current research projects will produce definitive answers that will satisfy any who want them. Nor do I suggest that while we await the research results, we should adopt precautionary principles. Who is to say where this policy should begin or end? Highly dangerous. I do offer encouragement to those campaigners who are generally concerned about the fate of the vulnerable, and I adjure the industry to take greater care with regard to the young. And I ask everyone here to contribute in any way they can to the development of further education programs so that debates about gambling can focus in the future much less on the problem element.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. We do have about 20 minutes or so for contributions.